250 years. For some nations, that is only a brief chapter in history. But for the United States, those 2.5 centuries have transformed a collection of 13 colonies into one of the world's most influential countries. On July 4th, 2026, millions of Americans gather in cities, suburbs, and small towns to celebrate a milestone unlike any before. Fireworks explode over rivers and skylines. Historic bells ring once again. Families gather for barbecues, parades fill streets from coast to coast, and communities pause to remember a single day that changed history forever. But this celebration is about much more than fireworks and festivities. It is about an idea that ordinary people could govern themselves, an idea that governments should derive their authority from the consent of the governed, an idea that liberty, equality, and opportunity should not belong to kings or emperors, but to every citizen. These principles have inspired admiration, debate, reform, and sometimes conflict for generations. The story of America has never been simple. It is a story of extraordinary achievements. It is also a story of difficult struggles. Moments of triumph have often been accompanied by moments of deep division. Yet through every challenge, the nation has continued to evolve. To understand why the 250th anniversary matters, we must travel back long before the Declaration of Independence was written, long before the first president took office, long before there was even a country called the United States. Long before European explorers crossed the Atlantic Ocean, North America was already home to thriving civilizations. Millions of indigenous people lived across forests, deserts, plains, mountains, and coastlines. Hundreds of nations developed unique languages, traditions, systems of government, and trading networks. Communities cultivated crops, built cities, managed natural resources, and created cultures that flourished for thousands of years. The continent was vibrant, diverse, and interconnected. Then, beginning in the late 15th century, European exploration reshaped the future of the continent. Spanish explorers arrived first, followed by French, Dutch, and English expeditions. Some came searching for new trade routes. Others sought precious metals, fertile land, or opportunities to expand their kingdoms. Over time, England established permanent settlements along the Atlantic coast. Jamestown, founded in 1607, became England's first permanent colony in North America. Soon after, Plymouth Colony was established by English settlers seeking religious freedom. Throughout the 17th century, additional colonies emerged, each developing its own identity while remaining under British rule. Eventually, 13 colonies stretched along the eastern coastline. Although separated by geography, economy, and religion, these colonies shared one important connection. They were subjects of the British Crown. For decades, the relationship worked reasonably well. The colonies enjoyed considerable freedom to govern many of their own local affairs. Farmers cultivated tobacco, rice, wheat, and corn. Merchants expanded trade throughout the Atlantic world. Shipbuilders, blacksmiths, artisans, and craftsmen helped growing towns prosper. Boston became a center of commerce. Philadelphia developed into one of the largest cities in North America. New York emerged as an increasingly important port connecting Europe, the Caribbean, and the colonies. Population expanded rapidly. Immigrants from across Europe arrived seeking opportunity, religious freedom, and land. Many believed the colonies offered possibilities unavailable elsewhere. Yet prosperity often came at a terrible human cost. Millions of enslaved Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic through the transatlantic slave trade. Their labor became central to large portions of the colonial economy, particularly in the southern colonies. Families were separated. Lives were forever changed. The contradiction between ideals of liberty and the reality of slavery would become one of the greatest challenges in American history. As the colonies continued growing, Britain fought expensive wars against rival European powers, particularly France. Victory came with enormous financial costs. The British government believed the American colonies should contribute more toward paying those debts. Beginning in the 1760s, Parliament introduced a series of new taxes: the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act. To British officials, these measures appeared reasonable. After all, Britain had spent vast sums defending its colonies. But many colonists viewed the taxes very differently.
Their complaint was not simply about money. It was about representation. Since the colonies had no elected representatives in the British Parliament, many argued that Parliament had no legitimate authority to tax them. Their protest became one of history's most famous political slogans: no taxation without representation. Public meetings grew larger. Pamphlets circulated throughout the colonies. Newspapers criticized British policies. Merchants organized boycotts against British goods. Ordinary citizens became increasingly involved in politics. What had begun as a dispute over taxation slowly transformed into something much larger: a debate about freedom itself. By 1773, tensions reached a breaking point. In Boston Harbor, a group of colonists boarded British ships carrying tea. Rather than paying the controversial tea tax, they threw more than 300 chests of tea into the water. The protest became known as the Boston Tea Party. To the colonists, it symbolized resistance. To Britain, it represented open defiance. The British government responded with harsh new measures, closing Boston Harbor and restricting local self-government. Instead of restoring order, these actions united many of the colonies. Leaders who had once disagreed now found common purpose. Across towns and villages, discussions increasingly focused on one extraordinary possibility. What if the colonies became independent? For many people in 1774, that idea still seemed almost impossible. Britain possessed one of the strongest militaries on Earth. Its navy dominated the oceans. Its economy was among the largest in the world. The American colonies had no professional army capable of matching British forces. Many colonists still considered themselves loyal British subjects. They hoped disagreements could be resolved peacefully. But events were moving faster than anyone expected. In September of 1774, representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for what became known as the First Continental Congress. Their goal was not yet independence. Instead, they hoped to present a united response to Britain's policies while protecting colonial rights. The delegates agreed to organize economic boycotts against British goods and called for greater cooperation among the colonies. For the first time, leaders from different regions were beginning to think of themselves not simply as Virginians, New Yorkers, or Pennsylvanians, but as Americans. Meanwhile, Britain refused to back down. King George III viewed the colonial protests as an act of rebellion rather than negotiation. British troops increased their presence throughout Massachusetts. Weapons were stockpiled. Militias trained in secret. Everyone sensed that conflict was approaching. Then, before sunrise on April 19, 1775, everything changed. British soldiers marched toward the towns of Lexington and Concord. Their mission was to seize colonial weapons and arrest rebel leaders. Instead, they encountered local militia. No one knows with certainty who fired the first shot, but once the smoke cleared, history had changed forever. That single gunshot became known as the shot heard around the world. It marked the beginning of the American Revolutionary War. Farmers left their fields. Shopkeepers closed their businesses. Teachers, blacksmiths, carpenters, fishermen, and laborers picked up muskets. Most had little military experience. Many lacked proper uniforms. Some had never fired a weapon in battle. Yet they believed they were fighting for something larger than themselves. Within weeks, thousands of volunteers surrounded British forces stationed in Boston. Although poorly equipped, the colonial militias demonstrated remarkable determination. The conflict soon spread throughout the colonies. In June 1775 came one of the war's earliest major battles, the Battle of Bunker Hill. Despite ultimately losing the position, colonial fighters inflicted heavy casualties on experienced British troops. The battle carried an important message. Victory against Britain would not be easy, but neither would defeating the Americans. Around the same time, the Continental Congress faced another enormous decision. If the colonies intended to defend themselves, they needed a unified military force. They also needed someone capable of leading it. Their choice fell upon a respected Virginian with military experience from the French and Indian War, George Washington. Tall, disciplined, and widely admired, Washington accepted the responsibility,
knowing success was far from guaranteed. He inherited an army facing enormous challenges. There were shortages of food, shortages of ammunition, shortages of uniforms. Many soldiers lacked shoes. Disease spread rapidly through crowded camps. Pay was inconsistent. Supplies often arrived late or not at all. Yet Washington understood that discipline and perseverance could sometimes overcome superior numbers. Throughout the summer and autumn of 1775, the conflict intensified. Still, many colonists hoped reconciliation remained possible. Then, early in 1776, one small publication transformed public opinion. Its title was Common Sense. Written by Thomas Paine, the pamphlet argued that independence was not only justified, it was necessary. Paine challenged the idea that a distant king should govern people living thousands of miles away. He questioned monarchy itself. He appealed directly to ordinary citizens rather than political elites. The message spread rapidly. Within months, hundreds of thousands of copies circulated throughout the colonies. Taverns, churches, marketplaces, and homes echoed with debates inspired by Paine's words. Public opinion shifted dramatically. More and more colonists concluded that reconciliation with Britain was no longer possible. If liberty was the goal, independence had become the only path forward. By June 1776, delegates once again gathered inside Pennsylvania State House in Philadelphia, today known as Independence Hall. The atmosphere was tense. Every person in the room understood the consequences of what they were about to decide. Declaring independence meant openly challenging the British crown. If the revolution failed, those who signed such a declaration could be charged with treason, a crime punishable by death. Yet despite the danger, momentum continued building. A committee was appointed to draft a formal declaration. Its members included Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. Thomas Jefferson, only 33 years old, received the responsibility of writing the first draft. Working in a rented room in Philadelphia, Jefferson carefully chose words that would resonate far beyond his own generation. He drew upon Enlightenment philosophy, especially the idea that every individual possesses natural rights that governments must protect. The opening paragraphs became some of the most influential political writing in history. The Declaration proclaimed that all people are created equal. It stated that individuals possess certain unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It argued that governments derive their authority from the consent of the governed, and when governments fail to protect those rights, the people have the authority to alter or abolish them. These ideas challenged centuries of political tradition. For much of history, kings claimed authority through hereditary rule or divine right. The Declaration offered a radically different vision. Power should flow upward from the people, not downward from a monarch. Over several days, delegates debated Jefferson's draft. Some passages were revised. Others were removed entirely. Every sentence mattered. Every word carried enormous weight. Finally, on July 4th, 1776, the Continental Congress approved the Declaration of Independence. The United States of America had officially declared itself a free and independent nation. The announcement did not immediately end the war. In fact, it guaranteed that the fighting would continue. Britain rejected the declaration. King George III considered the colonies to be an open rebellion. Victory would now have to be earned on the battlefield. Yet the declaration accomplished something equally important. It gave the revolution a clear purpose. The conflict was no longer simply about taxes or trade. It had become a struggle over the principles of self-government, liberty, and national independence. Across the colonies, public readings of the Declaration inspired celebration and determination. Church bells rang. Crowds gathered in town squares. Copies of the document were distributed throughout the new nation. Hope spread alongside uncertainty, because everyone understood one simple truth. Writing words on paper was one thing. Defending them against the greatest empire in the world would be something entirely different. The years that followed tested the resolve of the new nation in ways few could have imagined. The Continental Army faced overwhelming odds. British forces were larger, better trained, better equipped, and supported by the most powerful navy in the world. The Americans often lacked food, they lacked ammunition, they lacked proper uniforms. Many soldiers marched barefoot through snow, leaving trails of blood behind them. Disease spread through military camps faster than enemy bullets. Desertion became a constant concern. Some soldiers enlisted for only a few months before returning home to support their families. At times, the future of the revolution seemed almost hopeless. Yet George Washington understood something that many British commanders underestimated. Winning a war was not always about winning every battle. Sometimes, survival itself was victory. As long as the Continental Army remained in the field, the dream of independence remained alive. Washington avoided unnecessary risks. He retreated when necessary. He preserved his army whenever possible. Some criticized these decisions. Others called him overly cautious. History would ultimately prove his strategy correct. One of the revolution's defining moments came on Christmas night in 1776. The situation was desperate. Morale had collapsed. The Continental Army's enlistments were about to expire. Washington knew he needed a victory. Under the cover of darkness, thousands of soldiers crossed the icy Delaware River during a fierce winter storm. The journey was dangerous. Ice floated through the freezing water. Strong winds threatened to overturn boats carrying soldiers, horses, and artillery. Many men struggled simply to stand. After crossing the river, the exhausted army marched through snow toward the town of Trenton, New Jersey. At dawn on December 26th, they launched a surprise attack against Hessian troops fighting alongside the British. The victory was swift. It wasn't the largest battle of the war, but psychologically, it changed everything. For the first time in months, Americans believed victory was still possible. Hope returned. Support for the revolution grew stronger. The war continued across farms, forests, rivers, and towns. Families often found themselves divided. Some remained loyal to Britain. Others supported independence. Neighbors sometimes fought on opposite sides. The revolution was not simply a war between nations. It was also a civil conflict that divided communities and even households. As the fighting dragged on, the American cause gained an important ally, France. The French government saw an opportunity to weaken its longtime rival, Britain. After the American victory at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, France officially entered the war. French soldiers, naval forces, supplies, and financial assistance dramatically changed the balance of power. Spain and the Dutch Republic also provided support in various ways. What had begun as a colonial rebellion was becoming an international conflict. Years of exhausting warfare followed. Both sides achieved victories. Both suffered defeats. Entire towns experienced shortages. Families endured uncertainty. No one knew how or when the war would end. Then came the campaign that would decide the future of the revolution. In 1781, British General Charles Cornwallis established defensive positions near Yorktown, Virginia. Washington recognized an extraordinary opportunity. Working together with French General Rochambeau and supported by the powerful French fleet, American and French forces surrounded Yorktown. British escape by sea became impossible. Artillery bombarded British defenses day after day. Supplies dwindled. Morale collapsed. Finally, on October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. The image of British soldiers laying down their weapons became one of the defining moments of American history. Although minor fighting continued afterward, Yorktown effectively ended the Revolutionary War. 2 years later, in 1783, representatives of Britain and the United States signed the Treaty of Paris. Britain officially recognized the independence of the United States. After 8 years of war, the impossible had become reality. The 13 colonies had become an independent nation. Celebrations spread throughout the country. But victory brought a new challenge. Winning freedom was one achievement. Building a functioning nation would prove equally difficult. The United States had no king, no established national government capable of managing a growing republic, no tested political system that guaranteed long-term stability. The founders understood that if they failed to create an effective government, everything they had fought for could disappear. Initially, the new nation operated under the Articles of Confederation. The Articles intentionally limited the power of the national government. Most authority remained with individual states. After years of resisting British rule, Americans feared creating another powerful central government. But the Articles soon revealed serious weaknesses. Congress could not easily raise money. It struggled to pay soldiers. Trade disputes emerged between states. Foreign governments questioned whether the young nation could survive. Economic instability spread across many regions. Leaders increasingly recognized that reform had become essential. In 1787, delegates gathered once again in Philadelphia. Officially, they planned only to revise the Articles of Confederation. Instead, they decided to write an entirely new constitution. For months, delegates debated nearly every aspect of government. How should power be divided? How could smaller states receive fair representation alongside larger ones? How could future leaders be prevented from abusing authority? The discussions were often heated. Compromise became necessary. Eventually, the delegates produced one of the most influential political documents ever written. The Constitution of the United States established three separate branches of government. The legislative branch would make laws. The executive branch would enforce them. The judicial branch would interpret them. Each branch would possess powers capable of limiting the others. The system became known as checks and balances. Rather than concentrating authority in one ruler, power would remain divided. This design reflected lessons learned from both history and the Revolution itself. Soon afterward, the Bill of Rights was added to protect essential individual freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, the right to peaceful assembly, protection against unreasonable searches, the right to a fair trial. These principles would become foundational not only to the United States, but also to democratic movements around the world. The world's newest republic now possessed a government, but its greatest journey was only beginning. George Washington understood that every decision he made would establish traditions that future generations might follow for centuries. Although many people admired him and trusted his leadership, he knew the presidency could never resemble the monarchy the Revolution had rejected. In April 1789, George Washington took the oath of office as the first president of the United States in New York City, then the nation's capital. Crowds gathered to witness a moment unlike any before in American history. There was no royal coronation, no inherited throne, and no crown. Instead, authority rested on the Constitution and the will of the people. Washington surrounded himself with experienced advisors. Thomas Jefferson became the nation's first Secretary of State. Alexander Hamilton became Secretary of the Treasury. Henry Knox served as Secretary of War, while Edmund Randolph became the first Attorney General. Together they formed the first presidential cabinet, helping shape the executive branch from the ground up. One of the government's greatest challenges involved money. The Revolutionary War had left both the federal government and individual states burdened with heavy debt. Without financial stability, the young republic could struggle to survive. Alexander Hamilton proposed a bold financial plan. He argued that the federal government should assume the states' debts, establish a national bank, and create a stable financial system capable of encouraging trade and investment. His ideas sparked intense political debate. Thomas Jefferson believed states should retain greater authority and worried that a strong central government might threaten individual liberty. Hamilton believed a stronger federal government was essential for economic growth and national unity. These disagreements marked the birth of America's first political parties. Although they often challenged one another fiercely, their debates helped establish a tradition of political competition that continues today. Despite internal disagreements, the United States continued growing. Farmers pushed farther west, searching for fertile land and new opportunities. Families loaded their belongings into wagons, crossed mountains, and settled in territories that had once seemed unimaginably distant. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson made one of the most significant decisions in American history. France, led by Napoleon Bonaparte, offered to sell the vast Louisiana Territory. The opportunity was extraordinary. For approximately $15 million, The United States acquired more than 800,000 square miles of land, stretching from the Mississippi River toward the Rocky Mountains. The purchase nearly doubled the size of the nation. Almost overnight, America's future changed. Jefferson wanted to understand exactly what the country had acquired. He commissioned an expedition unlike any before. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark set out in 1804 with a small group known as the Corps of Discovery. Their mission was ambitious: map the newly acquired territory, study unfamiliar plants and animals, establish relationships with Native American nations, search for a practical water route connecting the eastern United States to the Pacific Ocean. The journey lasted more than 2 years. The expedition crossed rivers, climbed mountains, survived harsh winters, and encountered landscapes few Americans had ever seen. Along the way, they received invaluable assistance from a young Shoshone woman named Sacagawea, whose knowledge of the region and ability to communicate with different communities proved essential to the expedition's success. Although the explorers never found the hoped-for water route, their maps and observations dramatically expanded America's understanding of its western territories. As settlers moved westward, new towns appeared across the frontier. Roads connected distant communities. Steamboats transformed transportation along major rivers. Trade expanded rapidly. Agriculture flourished. Inventors introduced machines that made farming more productive and manufacturing more efficient. The Industrial Revolution, already changing Europe, began reshaping the American economy as well. Factories emerged near rivers where water powered machinery. Textile mills produced cloth at unprecedented speed. Iron production increased. Entrepreneurs invested in new businesses. Cities expanded as workers arrived seeking employment. The invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney revolutionized cotton production, making it far easier to separate cotton fibers from seeds. Cotton quickly became one of America's most valuable exports, strengthening the Southern economy. But technological progress came with a painful contradiction. The demand for cotton also increased the demand for enslaved labor. Instead of disappearing, slavery expanded across much of the South. Millions of African Americans remained trapped in a brutal system that denied them freedom, separated families, and treated human beings as property. While one part of the nation celebrated liberty and opportunity, another continued to rely on slavery as the foundation of its economy. This contradiction would become impossible to ignore. At the same time, westward expansion profoundly affected Native American nations. As settlers claimed more land, conflicts became increasingly common. Many indigenous communities were forced from ancestral territories through treaties, warfare, and government policies. Entire nations faced displacement. One of the darkest chapters came with the forced relocation of thousands of Native Americans from their homelands in the southeastern United States during the 1830s. Known today as the Trail of Tears, the journey resulted in immense hardship and the deaths of thousands of men, women, and children. For many indigenous nations, America's expansion brought not opportunity, but profound loss. Even as these struggles unfolded, innovation continued accelerating. In 1837, Samuel Morse demonstrated the electric telegraph. For the first time in history, information could travel across great distances almost instantly. Messages that once required days or weeks could now arrive within minutes. The telegraph transformed business, journalism, government, and communication, making the nation feel smaller and more connected than ever before. Railroads soon accelerated this transformation even further. During the early 19th century, traveling across America remained slow and difficult. Wagons struggled through muddy roads, rivers often served as the fastest highways, and journeys that covered only a few hundred miles could take weeks. Everything changed as railroad tracks stretched farther across the country. By the 1850s, trains were carrying passengers, crops, livestock, manufactured goods, and raw materials at speeds previous generations could hardly imagine. Communities once isolated from major cities suddenly found themselves connected to expanding markets. The railroad didn't simply shorten travel times, it united distant regions into a growing national economy. Businesses could reach more customers. Farmers could sell products farther from home. Manufacturers could receive supplies more quickly. America was becoming increasingly interconnected. At the same time, millions of immigrants crossed the Atlantic searching for opportunity. Families from Ireland escaped famine. Many Germans fled political instability and economic hardship. Others arrived from Scandinavia, Italy, Eastern Europe, and many other parts of the world. Some settled on farms across the Midwest. Others crowded into rapidly growing cities like New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, and Boston. They brought new languages, customs, religions, and traditions. Although many faced discrimination and difficult living conditions, immigrants played an essential role in building roads, railroads, factories, canals, and businesses that fueled America's expansion. The population continued growing at an astonishing pace. New states entered the Union. Cities expanded upward as buildings became larger and streets busier. Factories operated day and night. The American economy was becoming one of the fastest growing in the world. Yet beneath this remarkable growth, political tensions were becoming impossible to ignore. Every new territory joining the United States raised the same difficult question. Would slavery be allowed there? Northern states increasingly relied on manufacturing and wage labor. Southern states depended heavily on agriculture, supported by enslaved workers. The economic systems grew further apart. So did their political priorities. Compromises delayed confrontation, but never solved the underlying conflict. The Missouri Compromise attempted to balance free and slave states. Years later, the Compromise of 1850 sought another temporary solution. The Kansas-Nebraska Act introduced the idea that settlers themselves could decide whether slavery would be permitted. Instead of calming the nation, these measures intensified divisions. Violence erupted in Kansas as supporters and opponents of slavery fought for control of the territory. The newspapers called it Bleeding Kansas. For many Americans, it became clear that words alone might no longer prevent conflict. At the same time, a growing abolitionist movement demanded the complete end of slavery. Writers, ministers, journalists, and activists spoke against the institution with increasing determination. Among the most influential voices was Frederick Douglass, who escaped slavery and became a powerful advocate for freedom and equal rights. Harriet Tubman repeatedly risked her own life by guiding enslaved people to freedom through the Underground Railroad, a network of secret routes and safe houses. Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, reached millions of readers, exposing the cruelty of slavery and changing public opinion in many parts of the country. While abolitionists gained support in the North, many Southern leaders viewed these efforts as direct threats to their economy and way of life. Political compromise grew increasingly difficult. The nation that had declared all people possessed fundamental rights now stood deeply divided over whether those principles applied to everyone. The election of 1860 became one of the most consequential in American history. Abraham Lincoln, representing the newly formed Republican Party, opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories. Although he promised not to interfere with slavery where it already existed, many Southern leaders feared his election signaled a permanent shift in the balance of political power. Before Lincoln even took office, several Southern states announced they were leaving the Union. They formed the Confederate States of America and elected Jefferson Davis as their president. The United States faced a crisis unlike anything it had experienced since independence. Families found themselves divided. Brothers enlisted on opposite sides. Neighbors who had lived peacefully together now prepared for war. Businesses closed. Communities organized volunteer militias. Church bells rang as young men marched away, believing the conflict would end within weeks. Few imagined that the coming war would last 4 years and claim more American lives than any other conflict in the nation's history. In April 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. After 34 hours of bombardment, the Union garrison surrendered. The Civil War had begun. Across both the North and South, thousands rushed to enlist. They believed they were defending their homes, their principles, and their vision of America's future. No one yet realized that the conflict
would forever transform the nation. The Civil War quickly proved far more devastating than anyone had imagined. Both the Union and the Confederacy expected a short conflict. Instead, the war stretched across 4 long years, reshaping the nation through relentless battles, enormous sacrifice, and profound social change. The first major battle at Bull Run shattered any illusion of a quick victory. Thousands of soldiers marched into combat, believing the war would soon end. Instead, they witnessed the brutal reality of modern warfare. As casualties mounted, Americans realized they faced a conflict unlike any in the nation's history. New military technologies made battles deadlier than ever before. Rifled muskets increased accuracy over long distances. Railroads transported troops and supplies with unprecedented speed. The telegraph allowed commanders and political leaders to communicate almost instantly across hundreds of miles. Photography also transformed public understanding of war. For the first time, civilians could see haunting images of battlefields filled with destruction. The war no longer existed only in newspaper reports. It became a visible national tragedy. Among the conflict's most significant battles was Antietam, fought in September 1862. It remains the bloodiest single day in American military history. More than 20,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing in a single day of fighting. Although the battle ended without a decisive military victory, it provided President Abraham Lincoln with an opportunity to make one of the most consequential decisions of his presidency. On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The document declared that enslaved people living in Confederate-controlled territory were to be considered free. While it did not immediately end slavery everywhere in the United States, it fundamentally changed the purpose of the war. The conflict was no longer fought solely to preserve the Union. It had also become a struggle for human freedom. The proclamation inspired thousands of formerly enslaved men to join the Union Army. By the end of the war, nearly 180,000 African American soldiers had served in the United States colored troops. Their courage challenged long-standing prejudices and played an important role in securing Union victory. As the war continued, battles such as Gettysburg and Vicksburg became turning points. In July 1863, Union forces defeated Confederate General Robert E. Lee at Gettysburg after 3 days of fierce fighting. The battle claimed more than 50,000 casualties, making it one of the deadliest engagements of the war. Just 1 day later, Union forces captured Vicksburg, gaining control of the Mississippi River and effectively splitting the Confederacy in two. These victories shifted momentum toward the Union. Later that year, President Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg to dedicate a national cemetery. His speech lasted only a few minutes, yet the Gettysburg Address became one of the most influential speeches in American history. Rather than celebrating military success, Lincoln reminded the nation that the war represented a test of whether a government of the people, by the people, for the people, could endure. His words continue to inspire democratic societies around the world. Meanwhile, civilians endured tremendous hardship. Entire towns were destroyed. Families lost fathers, sons, brothers, and husbands. Hospitals overflowed with wounded soldiers. Disease claimed nearly as many lives as combat. Women assumed new responsibilities, managing farms, businesses, hospitals, and relief organizations, while many men remained on the battlefield. The conflict transformed everyday life across the country. By 1864, Union General Ulysses S. Grant pursued an aggressive strategy against Confederate forces, while General William Tecumseh Sherman launched his famous March to the Sea. Sherman's campaign targeted railroads, factories, warehouses, and military infrastructure supporting the Confederate war effort. His march demonstrated that modern warfare increasingly involved not only armies, but also the economic resources sustaining them. Finally, in April 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. After 4 years of unimaginable suffering, the Civil War was effectively over. The Union had survived. Slavery, the institution that had divided the nation for generations, was approaching its end. Later that year,
The 13th Amendment formally abolished slavery throughout the United States. For millions of African Americans, emancipation marked the beginning of a new chapter. Freedom, however, did not immediately guarantee equality. Formerly enslaved people now faced enormous challenges. Many lacked land, education, financial resources, and legal protection. Rebuilding both the South and the nation would prove extraordinarily difficult. Tragically, just days after the Confederate surrender, another devastating event shocked the country. On the evening of April 14, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. During the performance, he was shot by actor and Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth. Lincoln died the following morning. The nation mourned its leader. Millions lined railroad tracks as his funeral train carried his body across several states before burial in Springfield, Illinois. His assassination marked one of the darkest moments in American history. The years that followed became known as Reconstruction. The federal government attempted to rebuild the South while integrating formerly enslaved people into American civic life. 3 constitutional amendments dramatically reshaped the nation. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment guaranteed citizenship and equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment prohibited denying the right to vote based on race. Together, these amendments fundamentally expanded the meaning of American citizenship. Despite these legal changes, Reconstruction remained deeply contested. Political disagreements, economic hardship, and racial violence created new challenges. Progress often came slowly and unevenly. Yet the constitutional changes of this period established principles that would later become the foundation for the modern civil rights movement. While political leaders debated the nation's future, another transformation was already underway. Across the country, factories multiplied, railroads expanded toward the Pacific Ocean, and American industry entered an era of astonishing growth that would soon make the United States one of the world's leading economic powers. The decades following the Civil War witnessed one of the fastest periods of economic transformation in human history. Railroad tracks stretched across thousands of miles, linking the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. In 1869, the completion of the first transcontinental railroad marked a turning point for the nation. For the first time, passengers and freight could travel across the continent in days rather than months. The railroad became more than a transportation system. It connected farms to cities, factories to markets, families to distant communities. It fueled commerce, encouraged migration, and accelerated settlement throughout the American West. Towns sprang up almost overnight along the expanding rail network. Some grew into major cities. Others disappeared just as quickly when industries moved elsewhere. At the same time, a new generation of entrepreneurs transformed the American economy. Andrew Carnegie built one of the world's largest steel companies. John D. Rockefeller revolutionized the oil industry. J.P. Morgan reshaped banking and finance. Cornelius Vanderbilt expanded railroads and shipping. Their businesses helped turn the United States into an industrial giant. Steel became the backbone of modern America. It was used to construct bridges, railroads, skyscrapers, factories, and ships. Oil-powered factories heated homes and eventually fueled automobiles. Electricity transformed daily life. Thomas Edison and many other inventors developed technologies that illuminated cities after sunset. Factories could operate longer hours. Homes became brighter and safer. Streetlights changed urban life forever. Alexander Graham Bell's invention of the telephone allowed people to communicate instantly across great distances. Communication that once required days by mail could now occur in real time. Innovation was becoming one of America's defining strengths. Large cities expanded at remarkable speed. New York became one of the busiest ports in the world. Chicago emerged as the center of American transportation and manufacturing. Pittsburgh became famous for steel production. Detroit would soon become the heart of automobile manufacturing. Millions of immigrants continued arriving from Europe and other regions of the world. They came seeking jobs, safety, religious freedom, and better opportunities for their families. For many, the first sight of America was the Statue of Liberty rising above New York Harbor. Dedicated in 1886, the monument quickly became a powerful symbol of hope. Nearby, Ellis Island processed more than 12 million immigrants between 1892 and 1954. Doctors examined new arrivals. Officials reviewed documents. Families waited anxiously to learn whether they would be admitted. For countless people, passing through Ellis Island marked the beginning of a completely new life. The streets of America's growing cities reflected extraordinary diversity. Dozens of languages could be heard within a single neighborhood. Different cultures shared traditions, foods, music, and customs. This diversity became one of the nation's greatest strengths, while also presenting new social and political challenges. Rapid industrialization created enormous wealth, but prosperity was not shared equally. Many factory workers endured exhausting conditions. 12-hour workdays were common. Child labor remained widespread. Workplace accidents occurred frequently. Labor unions emerged to demand safer conditions, shorter hours, and fair wages. Strikes sometimes shut down factories and railroads across the country. The relationship between workers, employers, and government became one of the defining issues of the industrial age. Meanwhile, another revolution was quietly taking shape. Transportation itself was about to change forever. In the closing years of the 19th century, inventors around the world experimented with gasoline-powered vehicles. Among those who would transform the industry was Henry Ford. In 1908, Ford introduced the Model T. Unlike earlier automobiles built primarily for wealthy buyers, the Model T was designed to be affordable for ordinary families. Ford's moving assembly line dramatically reduced manufacturing time and costs. Cars that once required many hours to build could now be produced much more efficiently. The automobile changed America in ways few people could have predicted. Roads expanded across the nation. Gas stations appeared in towns and cities. Suburbs grew as families could travel greater distances for work. Tourism increased. Businesses adapted to a more mobile society. The car became not just transportation, but a symbol of independence and opportunity. At the same time, two brothers from Dayton, Ohio, were attempting something many believed impossible. Wilbur and Orville Wright had spent years studying flight. On December 17, 1903, at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, their powered aircraft lifted into the air for just 12 seconds. The flight covered only 120 feet. It seemed almost insignificant. Yet those 12 seconds changed the future of humanity. Within a few decades, airplanes would connect continents, transform commerce, and reshape warfare. As the 20th century began, the United States had become one of the world's fastest-growing industrial nations. The end of the First World War brought celebration, but it also introduced a new set of challenges. American soldiers returned home hoping to rebuild their lives. Factories that had produced military equipment shifted back to civilian manufacturing. The economy expanded rapidly throughout the 1920s, a period often remembered as the Roaring Twenties. Cities came alive with new music, entertainment, and cultural change. Jazz spread across the country. Radio became a household necessity, allowing millions of families to hear news, sports, and entertainment without leaving their homes. Hollywood emerged as the center of the global film industry. Motion pictures transformed popular culture, making actors and actresses internationally recognized celebrities. The American stock market soared. Businesses expanded. Consumer spending reached record levels. New products such as refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, and washing machines became increasingly common in American homes. Electricity reached more communities, changing everyday life for millions. Many people believed prosperity would continue forever, but beneath the surface, serious weaknesses remained hidden. Banks often issued risky loans. Investors borrowed heavily to purchase stocks. Many companies became overvalued as speculation replaced careful investing. On October 29, 1929, a day remembered as Black Tuesday, the stock market collapsed. Billions of dollars in wealth disappeared almost overnight. Banks failed, businesses closed, factories shut down. Millions of Americans lost their jobs.
Families who had once enjoyed comfortable lives suddenly struggled to afford food and housing. The Great Depression had begun. Throughout the 1930s, unemployment reached levels never before experienced in the United States. Long lines formed outside soup kitchens. People searched desperately for work. Some families lost their farms after years of drought devastated the Great Plains. Powerful dust storms swept across the region, creating what became known as the Dust Bowl. Thousands of farming families packed their belongings and traveled west, hoping to find new opportunities in states like California. The crisis affected nearly every American community. In 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt became President of the United States. Rather than accepting economic collapse as inevitable, Roosevelt introduced an ambitious series of government programs known as the New Deal. The federal government invested in roads, bridges, dams, schools, and public buildings. Millions found employment through public works projects. Programs were created to support farmers, stabilize banks, and provide assistance to unemployed workers. One of the most significant reforms established Social Security, creating a system of financial support for retired Americans and certain vulnerable groups. While economists continue to debate every aspect of the New Deal, there is broad agreement that it fundamentally changed the relationship between citizens and the federal government. Gradually, confidence began to return. Businesses slowly reopened. Employment improved. Yet, just as the nation started recovering, another global crisis emerged. Across Europe and Asia, aggressive governments expanded their military power. Germany, under Adolf Hitler, violated international agreements and invaded neighboring countries. Italy pursued territorial expansion. Japan continued its military campaigns throughout Asia. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war. The Second World War had begun. Initially, the United States remained officially neutral. Many Americans believed the country should avoid another overseas conflict. Even so, the government provided increasing economic and military support to allied nations through programs such as Lend-Lease. Everything changed on the morning of December 7, 1941. Without a formal declaration of war, Japanese aircraft launched a surprise attack on the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Battleships burned, aircraft were destroyed. More than 2,000 Americans lost their lives. News of the attack spread rapidly across the country. The following day, President Roosevelt addressed Congress, calling December 7th a date which will live in infamy. Congress declared war on Japan. Soon afterward, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. America had entered the Second World War. Factories that had struggled during the Depression suddenly operated around the clock. Automobile plants began producing tanks. Aircraft factories assembled thousands of military planes. Shipyards launched vessels at astonishing speed. Millions of women entered the workforce, filling positions previously held by men serving overseas. The image of Rosie the Riveter became a symbol of determination and national unity. Across Europe, American forces joined Allied armies in campaigns against Nazi Germany. On June 6, 1944, known forever as D-Day, Allied troops landed on the beaches of Normandy in one of history's largest amphibious military operations. The invasion marked the beginning of the liberation of Western Europe. Heavy fighting continued for months as Allied forces advanced toward Germany. In the Pacific, American forces fought across numerous islands in brutal battles against Japanese troops. Each victory came at an enormous cost. By 1945, Germany surrendered after Allied forces entered Berlin. The war in Europe was over. However, fighting in the Pacific continued. Seeking to end the conflict without a prolonged invasion of Japan, the United States used a new and devastating weapon. In August 1945, atomic bombs were dropped on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The destruction was unprecedented. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed or injured, both immediately and in the years that followed, due to radiation. The bombings remain among the most controversial decisions in modern history. Supporters argue they helped bring the war to a quicker end and avoided an even greater loss of life from a prolonged invasion. Critics point to the immense humanitarian consequences. Shortly after the bombings, Japan announced its surrender. The Second World War had ended. The conflict claimed tens of millions of lives worldwide. Entire cities had been destroyed. The global balance of power had changed dramatically. When peace returned, the United States emerged with an economy strengthened by wartime production, a powerful military, and growing influence on the international stage. The next era would not be defined by World War alone, but by a new rivalry that would shape global politics, science, technology, and space exploration for decades to come. Its factories produced enormous quantities of steel, machinery, textiles, and consumer goods. Its population continued expanding rapidly. Its cities reached unprecedented size. Its economy ranked among the strongest on Earth. Yet global events were about to draw America into conflicts far beyond its own borders. Across Europe, rival alliances, military competition, and political tensions were pushing the world toward a catastrophe unlike anything humanity had previously experienced. When the First World War erupted in 1914, the United States initially chose to remain neutral. President Woodrow Wilson believed America should avoid becoming involved in Europe's devastating conflict. For several years, the nation focused on trade and domestic growth while watching the war unfold from across the Atlantic. But neutrality became increasingly difficult to maintain. American ships faced growing dangers at sea. Economic ties with allied nations deepened. Public opinion gradually shifted. By 1917, the United States formally entered the war, sending millions of soldiers, sailors, and support personnel overseas. America's entry provided fresh resources and manpower that strengthened the Allied cause during the final stages of the conflict. When the war ended in 1918, the United States emerged not only as an industrial power, but also as an increasingly important force in international affairs. The nation's influence now extended far beyond its own borders, setting the stage for an even more dramatic century ahead. The years following the Second World War introduced a different kind of competition. Instead of fighting directly on battlefields, the world's two emerging superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, entered a period of political, economic, technological, and military rivalry known as the Cold War. Although they had been allies during the war, their visions for the future could not have been more different. The United States promoted democratic government and market-based economies. The Soviet Union supported a communist system with centralized political control. Neither side wanted another global war, yet both sought greater influence around the world. As tensions increased, Europe became divided by what British Prime Minister Winston Churchill famously described as the Iron Curtain. Countries aligned themselves with either the United States or the Soviet Union. Military alliances soon followed. In 1949, the United States joined with Canada and several European nations to establish the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, better known as NATO. The alliance declared that an attack on one member would be considered an attack on all. The Soviet Union later responded by creating the Warsaw Pact with its own allies. For decades, both sides invested enormous resources into military technology. Each developed increasingly powerful nuclear weapons capable of causing unimaginable destruction. The possibility of nuclear conflict created constant anxiety across the world. Schools conducted emergency drills. Families built backyard fallout shelters. Government leaders worked to prevent political crises from escalating into catastrophe. Despite these dangers, the Cold War also became a remarkable era of scientific achievement. One of its greatest competitions unfolded not on Earth, but in space. In October 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. The achievement shocked the United States. Americans suddenly realized that the nation needed to strengthen its investment in science, engineering, and education. In response, the United States established the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, in 1958. The space race had officially begun. American engineers, scientists, mathematicians, and astronauts worked tirelessly to close the technological gap.
Early missions tested rockets capable of carrying humans into orbit. Mercury astronauts demonstrated that Americans could survive spaceflight. The Gemini program developed techniques for long-duration missions, orbital maneuvers, and spacewalks. Each mission represented another step toward an even more ambitious goal. Then, on May 25, 1961, President John F. Kennedy addressed Congress with a bold challenge. He declared that the United States would land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth before the end of the decade. At the time, the goal seemed almost impossible. Computers were far less powerful than today's smartphones. Many of the required technologies had not yet been invented. Thousands of scientists, engineers, technicians, and contractors devoted years to solving one challenge after another. The effort became one of the largest scientific projects in history. Finally, on July 16, 1969, Apollo 11 lifted off from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Millions watched the launch live on television. 4 days later, astronaut Neil Armstrong descended the ladder of the lunar module Eagle and stepped onto the moon's surface. His words became immortal. "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Moments later, Buzz Aldrin joined him. Together, they explored the lunar surface, collected scientific samples, and planted the American flag. Back on Earth, hundreds of millions of people watched in amazement. The moon landing represented far more than a technological achievement. It demonstrated what could be accomplished through scientific innovation, determination, and international inspiration. Around the same time, another struggle was unfolding within the United States itself. Despite constitutional amendments guaranteeing equal protection under the law, many African Americans continued facing segregation, discrimination, and unequal access to education, employment, housing, and voting. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, the civil rights movement gained momentum. Ordinary citizens organized peaceful demonstrations demanding equal treatment under the law. In 1955, Rosa Parks refused to surrender her seat on a segregated bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Her arrest inspired the Montgomery bus boycott, a campaign that lasted more than a year and demonstrated the power of peaceful protest. A young pastor named Martin Luther King Jr. emerged as one of the movement's most influential leaders. He advocated nonviolent resistance, inspired by the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi and principles of justice and equality. Across the South, students organized sit-ins at segregated restaurants. Freedom riders challenged segregated interstate transportation. Thousands marched despite arrests, intimidation, and violence. One of the defining moments came in August 1963, when more than 200,000 people gathered in Washington, D.C. for the March on Washington. Standing before the Lincoln Memorial, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. He spoke of a future in which people would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. His message resonated across America and around the world. The movement contributed to landmark legislation. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in many areas of public life. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 strengthened protections for voting rights, helping remove barriers that had prevented many African Americans from participating fully in elections. These laws marked major milestones in America's continuing effort to fulfill the principles expressed nearly 2 centuries earlier in the Declaration of Independence. Even as the nation celebrated achievements in science and civil rights, another conflict deeply divided the American public. The Vietnam War gradually expanded throughout the 1960s. Initially involving military advisors, American participation grew into a major military commitment. Hundreds of thousands of U.S. service members served in Southeast Asia. The conflict became increasingly controversial at home. Television brought images of war directly into American living rooms. College campuses became centers of debate and protest. Many questioned the purpose, cost, and human consequences of continued involvement. After years of fighting, the United States gradually reduced its military presence. The war left lasting impacts on veterans, families, and American society. It also influenced how future leaders approached military intervention abroad. Yet, despite political disagreements and social challenges, innovation continued transforming everyday life. Computers became smaller and more capable. Medical advances improved life expectancy. Commercial aviation connected distant cities faster than ever before. American universities became global centers of research. The nation's economy continued evolving, driven by technology, education, entrepreneurship, and scientific discovery. A new era was beginning, one that would eventually be defined not only by factories and automobiles, but by microchips, personal computers, and the digital revolution that would reshape the world. The digital revolution began quietly. Unlike the Industrial Revolution, which filled cities with factories and railroads, this new transformation started inside laboratories, research centers, and university classrooms. Tiny silicon chips, no larger than a fingernail, would eventually change the way billions of people lived, worked, communicated, and learned. During the 1970s, computers remained enormous machines used primarily by governments, universities, and large corporations. Few people imagined that one day nearly every household would own a personal computer. Among those who saw that future were a new generation of entrepreneurs. In garages, workshops, and small offices, inventors experimented with ideas that challenged the traditional computing industry. Companies such as Apple and Microsoft helped make computers smaller, more affordable, and easier for ordinary people to use. What had once required an entire room could now fit on a desk. Businesses quickly recognized the possibilities. Banks processed transactions faster. Schools introduced computer education. Hospitals improved record keeping. Engineers designed increasingly sophisticated machines. The workplace itself began changing. By the 1980s, computers were no longer luxury devices reserved for specialists. They were becoming everyday tools. At the same time, another historic transformation unfolded overseas. Throughout the 1980s, the Soviet Union experienced growing economic and political difficulties. Reform movements spread across Eastern Europe. Citizens demanded greater political freedom. In 1989, television cameras captured one of the defining moments of the 20th century. Thousands of people gathered around the Berlin Wall. For nearly 3 decades, the wall had symbolized the division between East and West. Now, ordinary citizens began dismantling it with hammers, chisels, and their bare hands. Images of families embracing after years of separation became symbols of hope around the world. Just 2 years later, in 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved. The Cold War had come to an end. For the United States, it marked the conclusion of more than 4 decades of global rivalry. Many believed a new era of international cooperation was beginning. Yet history rarely follows a simple path. Even as one geopolitical conflict ended, new challenges emerged. In 1990, Iraq invaded neighboring Kuwait. The invasion threatened regional stability and international energy supplies. A broad international coalition, led by the United States, responded. Operation Desert Storm demonstrated the effectiveness of advanced military technology, including precision-guided weapons, satellite communications, and stealth aircraft. The conflict ended quickly compared with earlier wars, but it highlighted how rapidly modern warfare had evolved. Meanwhile, inside the United States, a communication revolution was accelerating. Researchers had developed interconnected computer networks for decades. By the early 1990s, those networks became accessible to the general public through what became known as the Internet. At first, many people viewed it as an interesting experiment. Few predicted how completely it would reshape society. Email replaced traditional letters. Businesses created websites. Universities shared research instantly across continents. Online shopping emerged. Search engines made vast amounts of information available within seconds. Communication became faster than at any previous point in human history. The internet erased geographical barriers in ways earlier generations could scarcely imagine. A student in a small American town could access knowledge from libraries around the world. Small businesses could sell products internationally. Families, separated by oceans, could communicate almost instantly. The pace of globalization increased dramatically. Technology companies grew into some of the world's most valuable businesses. America entered the 21st century with remarkable confidence. Its economy remained among the world's strongest. Innovation continued driving growth. Scientific research expanded rapidly. Yet, on a clear Tuesday morning in September 2001, everything changed. September 11th began like any ordinary day. Millions of Americans prepared for work. Children attended school. Airports bustled with travelers. Financial markets prepared to open. Then, at 8:46 in the morning, a hijacked commercial airliner struck the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. At first, many believed it had been a tragic accident. 17 minutes later, a second aircraft crashed into the South Tower. The horrifying images were broadcast live around the world. There was no longer any doubt. The United States was under attack. A third hijacked aircraft struck the Pentagon near Washington, D.C. A fourth plane crashed into a field in Pennsylvania after passengers fought to regain control from the hijackers. Within hours, the Twin Towers collapsed. Dense clouds of dust filled lower Manhattan. Firefighters, police officers, emergency medical workers, and ordinary civilians risked their lives attempting to rescue survivors. Nearly 3,000 people lost their lives in the attacks. Citizens from more than 90 countries were among the victims. The attacks became one of the darkest days in American history. Across the country, communities gathered in prayer services and memorials. American flags appeared outside homes, businesses, schools, and public buildings. The nation mourned together. In response, the United States launched what became known as the War on Terror. Military operations began in Afghanistan with the goal of dismantling al-Qaeda and removing the Taliban government that had provided sanctuary to the terrorist organization responsible for the attacks. Several years later, in 2003, the United States led an invasion of Iraq. The decision generated significant international debate and remains the subject of continuing historical and political discussion. Both conflicts lasted far longer than many initially expected. Thousands of American service members served overseas. Many allied nations also contributed troops and humanitarian assistance. The wars affected military families, veterans, and communities across the United States for decades. At home, security procedures changed dramatically. Airports introduced enhanced screening. Intelligence agencies expanded cooperation. Emergency preparedness became a greater national priority. The events of September 11th permanently reshaped American foreign policy, national security, and public life. Even during these difficult years, innovation continued advancing at an extraordinary pace. Mobile phones evolved from simple communication devices into powerful handheld computers. High-speed internet connected homes across the country. Digital cameras replaced film. Music, movies, and books increasingly moved online. A new generation was growing up in a world where information could be accessed almost instantly from nearly anywhere. The foundations of the modern digital age had been firmly established, setting the stage for another wave of innovation that would transform business, healthcare, education, transportation, and everyday life in ways that even the pioneers of the computer revolution had never imagined. The rapid spread of smartphones accelerated this transformation even further. By the late 2000s, millions of Americans were carrying devices more powerful than the computers that had guided astronauts to the moon decades earlier. A smartphone was no longer simply a telephone. It became a camera, a map, a television, a bank, a classroom, a workplace, and for many people, the primary connection to the world around them. Social media platforms reshaped how information traveled. News that once required hours or even days to reach the public could now spread across the globe within seconds. Citizens shared photographs, videos, and eyewitness accounts directly from major events. Businesses discovered entirely new ways to reach customers. Political campaigns adapted to digital communication. Journalists found themselves reporting in an environment where information moved faster than ever before. At the same time, streaming services transformed entertainment. Instead of waiting for scheduled television broadcasts, audiences could watch movies, documentaries, and television series whenever they chose. Music shifted from physical CDs to online libraries containing millions of songs. Shopping also changed dramatically. Online retailers allowed consumers to purchase products with a few taps on a screen and receive deliveries at their homes within days, or sometimes even hours. Technology was reshaping nearly every aspect of everyday life. Then, in 2008, another major challenge tested the resilience of the American economy. Years of risky lending practices and instability within the housing market triggered a severe financial crisis. Banks faced enormous losses. Major financial institutions either collapsed or required emergency assistance. Stock markets around the world declined sharply. Businesses reduced hiring. Millions of Americans lost jobs, homes, or retirement savings. The crisis quickly spread beyond the United States, affecting economies across the globe. In response, the federal government and the Federal Reserve introduced emergency measures designed to stabilize financial markets, restore confidence, and prevent an even deeper economic collapse. Recovery required years of effort. Businesses gradually reopened. Employment slowly improved. Entrepreneurs launched new companies. Innovation once again became a major driver of economic growth. The technology sector expanded rapidly. Companies specializing in cloud computing, artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, biotechnology, and renewable energy attracted significant investment. America remained one of the world's leading centers for entrepreneurship. Every year, thousands of startups emerged with ideas capable of transforming entire industries. Universities continued producing groundbreaking scientific research. Medical discoveries improved treatments for numerous diseases. Engineers developed increasingly sophisticated robotics. Autonomous vehicle technology advanced steadily. Private companies began competing in areas once dominated exclusively by governments. Among the most significant developments was the rise of commercial space exploration. For decades, spaceflight had been led primarily by national governments. Now, private aerospace companies demonstrated that commercial innovation could play a major role in exploring beyond Earth. Reusable rockets dramatically reduced launch costs. Cargo missions regularly supplied astronauts aboard the International Space Station. Human spaceflight returned from American soil after nearly a decade. Plans for future missions to the Moon and eventually Mars moved from science fiction toward engineering reality. Meanwhile, another unexpected crisis emerged. In late 2019, reports of a new coronavirus began spreading internationally. Within months, COVID-19 had reached nearly every corner of the world. By early 2020, daily life across the United States changed dramatically. Schools temporarily closed. Many offices shifted to remote work. Sporting events were postponed. Air travel declined sharply. Restaurants and businesses faced unprecedented challenges. Hospitals worked tirelessly to treat rapidly increasing numbers of patients. Doctors, nurses, emergency responders, and healthcare workers served on the front lines under extraordinarily difficult conditions. Scientists around the world collaborated at unprecedented speed. Researchers shared genetic data. Clinical trials progressed rapidly. Within a remarkably short period, vaccines were developed, tested, and distributed. The pandemic highlighted both the vulnerabilities and the remarkable capabilities of modern science, medicine, and international cooperation. Communities adapted in creative ways. Teachers embraced online learning. Businesses expanded digital services. Families discovered new methods of staying connected despite physical distance. The experience accelerated technological changes that might otherwise have taken many years. Remote work became common across numerous industries. Telemedicine expanded access to healthcare. Digital collaboration tools transformed workplaces. As the country gradually emerged from the pandemic, attention shifted toward economic recovery. Manufacturing rebounded. Consumer spending increased. Infrastructure projects received renewed investment. At the same time, inflation and supply chain disruptions created new economic challenges for households and businesses alike. Policymakers debated the best approaches to maintaining growth while controlling rising prices. Through each challenge, One technological breakthrough began attracting extraordinary global attention: artificial intelligence. Although researchers had studied AI for decades, advances in computing power, machine learning, and massive data sets dramatically accelerated its capabilities during the early 2020s. AI systems began assisting doctors in analyzing medical images. Engineers used AI to improve manufacturing efficiency. Scientists employed machine learning to accelerate research. Businesses automated routine tasks. Students gained access to powerful educational tools. Creative professionals explored entirely new forms of design, writing, music, and visual production. At the same time, AI raised important questions. How should these systems be regulated? How could privacy be protected? Which jobs might change as automation expanded? How should society balance innovation with responsibility? Governments, universities, technology companies, and international organizations all began examining these issues. The conversation continues today, reflecting both the enormous opportunities and significant responsibilities accompanying one of the most important technological revolutions since the invention of the Internet. As America approached its 250th year of independence, the nation once again found itself standing at the beginning of a new era. The tools shaping the future were no longer powered primarily by steam engines, railroads, or assembly lines. They were increasingly driven by data, advanced computing, biotechnology, clean energy, and artificial intelligence. Yet despite all the technological progress, the ideals first expressed in 1776 continued to influence national conversations. Questions about liberty, opportunity, equality, innovation, representative government, and the responsibilities of citizenship remain just as relevant in the 21st century as they had nearly 2.5 centuries earlier. The United States had changed beyond anything its founders could have imagined, but the journey was still far from over. The arrival of 2026 marked more than the beginning of another calendar year. It represented a historic milestone. 250 years had passed since delegates in Philadelphia approved the Declaration of Independence and announced to the world that a new nation had been born. Across the United States, preparations for the semi-quincentennial, the nation's 250th anniversary, had been underway for years. Federal agencies, state governments, museums, historical societies, schools, military organizations, and local communities worked together to organize one of the largest national commemorations in American history. Historic landmarks underwent restoration. Special exhibitions showcased rare documents and artifacts connected to the Revolution. Educational programs introduced younger generations to the nation's founding story. Communities large and small prepared parades, concerts, cultural festivals, and public ceremonies celebrating America's diverse history. Philadelphia, where independence had first been declared in 1776, once again became the symbolic heart of the celebration. Visitors from across the United States and around the world gathered near Independence Hall, where the Declaration had been debated and approved nearly 2.5 centuries earlier. The Liberty Bell, long recognized as a symbol of freedom, attracted thousands of visitors each day. Historical reenactors dressed in 18th century clothing recreated scenes from the Revolutionary era. Musicians performed patriotic compositions alongside contemporary American music, representing the nation's cultural diversity. In Washington, D.C., national monuments became gathering places for millions of visitors. The National Mall hosted concerts, educational exhibitions, and ceremonies honoring military veterans, public servants, scientists, educators, healthcare workers, and countless ordinary citizens whose contributions shaped the nation. Across New York City, fireworks illuminated the skyline above the Hudson and East Rivers. Chicago celebrated along the shores of Lake Michigan. Los Angeles organized festivals highlighting the cultural diversity that defines modern America. Small towns from Maine to Alaska held community parades where local marching bands, firefighters, veterans, students, and volunteers marched proudly through streets decorated with American flags. For many families, the celebration remained deeply personal.
Children learned about ancestors who had immigrated in search of opportunity. Military families remembered generations who had served during times of war and peace. Communities honored teachers, first responders, medical professionals, entrepreneurs, farmers, factory workers, artists, engineers, and countless others whose everyday efforts helped build the nation. The anniversary was not simply a celebration of famous presidents or historic battles. It was also a recognition of millions of ordinary Americans whose work, sacrifice, creativity, and perseverance shaped the country's history. America in 2026 stood as one of the world's largest economies. Its universities attracted students from nearly every nation. Its research institutions remained global leaders in medicine, engineering, artificial intelligence, and scientific discovery. American companies continued developing technologies influencing communication, transportation, entertainment, healthcare, finance, and space exploration across the globe. NASA prepared for humanity's return to the moon through the Artemis program, while private aerospace companies continued advancing reusable rockets and planning future missions deeper into the solar system. Artificial intelligence rapidly expanded into healthcare, education, manufacturing, agriculture, and scientific research. Clean energy technologies continued growing alongside traditional energy industries. Electric vehicles became increasingly common on American roads. Biotechnology opened new possibilities for treating diseases once considered incurable. Universities and research laboratories pursued breakthroughs in quantum computing, advanced robotics, and sustainable energy systems. At the same time, America continued confronting important questions about its future. How could economic opportunity be expanded for every community? How should rapidly advancing technologies be governed responsibly? How could democratic institutions continue adapting to an increasingly digital world? How should future generations balance economic growth with environmental stewardship? These conversations reflected a tradition dating back to the nation's earliest years. American history has never been defined by unanimous agreement. Rather, it has been shaped by debate, compromise, reform, and the continual effort to improve upon the ideals expressed in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Looking back across 2.5 centuries, the scale of America's transformation is extraordinary. A nation that began with approximately 2.5 million people living along the Atlantic coast grew into a country of more than 340 million residents, spanning 50 states and influencing events around the world. Wooden sailing ships gave way to aircraft capable of crossing oceans within hours. Horse-drawn wagons evolved into interstate highways, high-speed transportation, and commercial aviation. Letters requiring weeks to arrive were replaced by instant global communication. The first printed newspapers gave way to television, the internet, and artificial intelligence capable of processing information at unprecedented speed. Yet some principles remained remarkably consistent. The belief that citizens possess fundamental rights, the idea that governments derive authority from the people, the importance of civic participation, the value of innovation, the pursuit of opportunity. These ideals have been challenged, expanded, debated, and reinterpreted across generations. They have inspired reform movements, scientific discoveries, constitutional amendments, and countless acts of public service. America's story has never been one of perfection. It includes triumphs that changed the course of history. It also includes painful chapters involving slavery, civil war, discrimination, economic hardship, and political division. Understanding the nation's past requires acknowledging both its achievements and its shortcomings. History becomes most valuable not when it presents a flawless narrative, but when it honestly examines the successes and failures that shape the present. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson of the American journey. Progress rarely follows a straight line. Each generation inherits both remarkable accomplishments and difficult challenges from those who came before. Each generation is then asked to build something better for those who will follow. The delegates who signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776 could never have imagined satellites orbiting Earth, astronauts walking on the moon, artificial intelligence assisting scientific research, or millions of people watching national celebrations through devices held in the palms of their hands.
Yet they believed in an idea powerful enough to outlive them, an idea that free people could shape their own future. 250 years later, that conversation continues. The story of the United States is still being written, not only by presidents, lawmakers, scientists, soldiers, and inventors, but by teachers inspiring students, doctors saving lives, entrepreneurs creating opportunities, artists expressing new ideas, volunteers strengthening communities, and ordinary citizens participating in the daily life of a democratic nation. As fireworks once again light the skies above cities, rivers, mountains, deserts, and coastlines on the 4th of July, they illuminate far more than a celebration of the past. They remind millions of Americans of a promise first declared in Philadelphia in 1776, a promise that every generation has the responsibility to protect, improve, and pass forward. From 13 colonies along the Atlantic coast to one of the world's most influential nations, from handwritten declarations to artificial intelligence, from candlelit meeting rooms to spacecraft traveling beyond Earth, the journey of the United States over the past 250 years stands as one of history's most remarkable stories. And as the nation celebrates this historic anniversary, one truth remains clear. The first 250 years are history. The next chapter is still waiting to be written. Thank you for watching.